Her name is Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
I hope I pronounce her name properly. Thais Gibson.
I am so excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's episode, and I am really excited to share this powerful episode with you here today, especially if you're interested in learning a little bit more about thyroid health. Our guest today is Izabella Wentz. After being diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis herself in 2009, Dr. Wentz was surprised at the lack of knowledge about the lifestyle interventions for Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism, and autoimmune conditions. I cannot wait. If you are somebody who is struggling with feeling like you have inflammation issues, brain fog when you wake up in the morning, anything of that nature, this may give you some really powerful gold nuggets, and hopefully will be a deep dive into you better understanding the root cause of health. So can't wait to share this with you. Let me know what you think in the comments down below about this episode. If you want to hear more from Dr. Izabella, then please also let me know. We'd love to have her back, and can't wait to share more episodes like this with you in the future. Thank you so much, Isabella, for being here with us today. Really excited for this discussion. And I just want to start by saying, before we even get into anything else, that I read a couple of your books. And I will say, as somebody who's been reading a lot of health books over the past couple of years, I would say those are two of the best books that I've read. So highly recommend. But before we even get into any of that, if you want to maybe just start by sharing a little bit about yourself and your background and how you sort of got into this field of work to begin with.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. It's just such a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you for the work that you're doing in the world. The funny thing is, I'm a pharmacist by training, and I was never really interested in the thyroid until I was diagnosed myself with a thyroid condition in my 20s. And it was this huge aha moment for me where I was like, this is why I'm tired all the time. This is why I'm anxious. This is why I have so many of these symptoms. And being a pharmacist, I got really excited to have like the diagnosis and the treatment. So I was like, great, I can get on thyroid meds, right? But the medications only helped me a little bit. And so I still struggled with the majority of the original symptoms I still had. So instead of sleeping like 12 hours a night, I only needed 11 hours a night, but I was still anxious. I still had carpal tunnel. I still had this awful fatigue. I was this person that wanted to do a lot in the world and had all of these ideas, but my body, I felt like I was stuck in the body of like a couch potato, right? It was like the mind was so disconnected from the body. And through just my own journey and my own diagnosis, I wanted to know if there was anything that I could do to make myself feel better in addition to medications, perhaps as a supplement to the medications. And then I came across the root cause approach, and I came across all of these different strategies and things that I could do to get myself to feel better. And thankfully I was able to get myself, into remission from Hashimoto's and get myself feeling like a normal functioning human about 10 plus years ago. And I ended up writing about my own experiences with the hope that, hey, if I could go from somebody that's like chronically fatigued and exhausted to having a lot of energy and feeling like calm and energized and productive and just really balanced, then perhaps other people can too with some of these methods that I've uncovered. And so that's how I became the thyroid pharmacist. It wasn't really, intentional. It just really became this way because I had to heal myself, and I was hoping that what worked for me would help others too.
That's really powerful. And I think that sometimes I've heard this quote before. It's like, you make your mess your message, and I think there's something really beautiful about going through that journey yourself, and then how meaningful and impactful that is for you. Of course, you want to share that with other people. So you mentioned a whole bunch of really interesting things that I think people probably if they're newer to this kind of journey would be like, carpal tunnel, like what does that have to do with my thyroid? And so for anybody who's new to this sort of information, what might be some symptoms besides just like the traditional sluggishness and exhaustion that people could see that may actually be related back to thyroid challenges that they're having?
Well, it's such a good question because the thyroid hormones impact every cell in the body. So from like head to toes, we can have thyroid symptoms. Hair loss is a really common thyroid symptom that women experience. In fact, it was one of my first symptoms. that got me questioning what was going on with my hormones. Loss of eyebrows, especially the upper third of the eyebrow, can be a symptom of thyroid issues. Having puffy eyes or a puffy face can be a symptom. Having brain fog, or like walking into a room and forgetting why you walked in there, having trouble with word finding. I mean, I was in my 20s and I was like, what is going on with me? Do I need to get tested for Alzheimer's? Why am I so forgetful all of a sudden when I used to have this amazing memory? Having a hoarse voice could be a symptom. Having an enlarged thyroid gland, so perhaps some bulging on your neck, this might be a potential symptom. Then we can have issues with excess weight gain. Some people do experience that, although some people might have actually, there might be losing too much weight without wanting to be losing weight. Symptoms like anxiety are very common in the early stages. Depression might be common in the later stages. I've seen some people being misdiagnosed with things like bipolar disorder, even psychotic disorder in the early stages of thyroid issues, when there's thyroid storm kind of situations going on where the thyroid hormones are just fluctuating and all over the place. Fertility issues. These are so common. And it just breaks my heart how many people, how many women and men alike that maybe never had the opportunity to have children in their life or had multiple miscarriages, all because they had altered thyroid function that perhaps a little bit of medicine, a little bit of, changing your diet, maybe a few supplements could have completely reversed and allowed you to have children if that's your dream. Another thing is going to be digestive issues. Not a lot of people know this, but thyroid issues, actually about 18.5% of people with irritable bowel syndrome have thyroid dysfunction, most of them subclinical hypothyroidism. And acid reflux is going to be a very common symptom. And some of these like joint pains in the body, so carpal tunnel, swelling, feeling like you have, you're walking and your knees hurt, or you wake up with swollen feet. These are all potential thyroid symptoms. I'm actually working on a blog of all of the different symptoms that can occur, but these are some of the most common ones that I see in people that I've worked with. And libido issues, of course, and that's especially common in men. Women will typically tell me about all the other things that are going on. Men will say, I'm having issues with my libido and like my muscles are just like disappearing.
Wow. And that was something that was so powerful to me when I was reading I read the root cause book, and it was just, I was going through and reading like, oh my goodness, so many of these things are affecting so many people in different ways. And I'm a big believer that if you only address the surface symptoms of things, that like you almost enable the root causes to stay alive. And I think that we sort of live in a world and a society where, and I'm sure you saw this as a pharmacist, where it's like, give medication, give prescription pills. And as somebody who's worked in the mental health field, it was always like, give antidepressants or SSRIs of some type. And I'm not saying that those are negative things, because there can absolutely be a really powerful time and place for those things. But where it becomes problematic is when we are just addressing the surface symptoms and we are not looking for root cause. And so that was something I really, really loved about your work. So can we go through some of the differences for people who may be new to this and they're even maybe hearing some of themselves in these symptoms already? How can we start telling the difference between things like Hashimoto's versus Graves' disease versus hyper versus hypothyroid? Will you help us sort of, pull those different ones apart?
Absolutely. So thyroid dysfunction can happen primarily when our body makes too much thyroid hormone, and that sort of speeds up the body. This is known as hyperthyroidism, or an overactive thyroid. So this is the person that is very, anxious, they're too thin, they might have palpitations, they might have like hand tremors, a lot of diarrhea. Issues like anxiety are going to be very common, potentially some cardiac issues. This is kind of the one end of the extreme. And then the other one is hypothyroidism, an underactive thyroid, where we have a slowing down of our, metabolism, everything that's going on with our body. So when we have an underactive thyroid, we're going to feel kind of sluggish. Our brain's going to feel slow. We're more likely to be depressed. We're more likely to not feel cold all the time. We're more likely to put on excess weight and have more constipation. Now, this is kind of like the black and white. So if you had too much thyroid hormone, you would have hyperthyroidism. If you didn't have enough, you'd have an underactive thyroid. Now, where it gets a little bit muddled, I would say, is that most cases of both an overactive thyroid and an underactive thyroid are autoimmune in nature. So what does that mean exactly? That means that our immune system has started producing antibodies to parts of the thyroid. And in the case of Hashimoto's disease, which is responsible for like 90 to 97% of cases of an underactive thyroid, this is going to be thyroid peroxidase antibodies, and this is going to be thyroglobulin antibodies. And this actually autoimmune pathway, this mechanism actually leads to the destruction of your thyroid gland. So initially, you're going to have your thyroid is going to be damaged and destroyed, and that's going to send little bits of thyroid hormone into your bloodstream. And this can actually cause some of the symptoms of hyperthyroidism, where you're anxious and you're having diarrhea and you're like, what is going on with me? I'm super irritable. And then once that clears out of your body, then you might actually feel more hypothyroid and have those low thyroid symptoms. And this can go on for 10 years. And it's interesting, people in that stage are usually their thyroid hormone is tested, and the doctors, depending on the day, it might be normal, it might be underactive, it might be overactive, right?
Wow.
And so a lot of times, unfortunately, people are misdiagnosed with mental health symptoms when they're in those stages. With Graves' disease, one of the there's thyroid, that can be thyroid stimulating antibodies that actually cause us to make more thyroid hormone. And with Graves' disease, this is also an autoimmune way that an autoimmune pathway that affects the thyroid gland. And so both of these might be present depending on the person. Hashimoto's tends to be the more common one. So we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that. And that is going to be the main reason for hypothyroidism. I feel like this is also the one that's more commonly misdiagnosed. One of the reasons is people with Graves' disease, the same antibodies they have that work against their thyroid also tend to have an impact on their eyes. And in some cases, they might have like protruding eyes, which are, I feel like for the average physician, they're much more easier to notice when you can see it physically in somebody's face. It's like, okay, you've got, I could see that your eyes are protruding, and I could see that you've got some tremors, right? These are very physical symptoms that are a little bit harder to write off than like, oh, you're tired and you're gaining some weight, right?
Yeah, really interesting. And so if somebody is going through this whole experience, and let's say they recently got diagnosed with a thyroid issue, or let's say they're concerned that they have a thyroid issue, and they're going to sort of start this journey, what do you think when we talk about autoimmunity, some of those root causes really are? Because that was something I found so powerful about reading your book and following some of your work, is that like, wow, there's so much in our world that we're intaking all the time that can be affecting us at a really root cause level. So and the other thing that I thought was so inspiring for people, and part of why I wanted to really, share some of your work, is that you were diagnosed with Hashimoto's and then you went into remission. And so you were able to address things in a really healthy manner that allowed you, it doesn't have to feel like if somebody's going through this, that's, the end of the tunnel, good luck for life, you're stuck with this, there's actually a way out. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those different root causes?
Of course. So some of the more common root causes are going to be food sensitivities, the most common one being gluten and celiac disease, nutrient depletion, some of the common ones being selenium, vitamin D. They can be very helpful in getting into remission. Impaired stress response. So I talk a lot about adrenals and how do you really balance your stress response. And I'm sure community listening is well aware about trauma. So trauma can be an important root cause, right? We can also get into chronic infections. A lot of times I find intestinal permeability and chronic infections, if somebody's done a lot of like the low-hanging fruit of like working on your stress, working on getting some nutrients on board and cleaning up your diet, and they're still not feeling their best, there's oftentimes going to be either infections, intestinal permeability, or an impaired ability to get rid of toxins.
Okay, so really powerful stuff. So let's go through each one at a time for a moment. So gluten. So obviously people like it's very common to have gluten sensitivities, and maybe that's because of like a lot of glyphosate in gluten, or what? Why do you think that's been a huge thing to begin with?
I think there's a lot of different reasons, and one of them, kind of the first one that is a biggie is celiac disease. So in Hashimoto's, about anywhere from like 1.5 to 15% of people with Hashimoto's actually also have celiac disease. And studies have found that if a person who has both Hashimoto's and celiac gets off of gluten, both conditions can go into remission. Even up to 20% of Hashimoto's cases can get into remission. So this is one very relevant factor. Another one is going to be related to potentially SIBO. So about 50% of people with hypothyroidism have been shown in research to have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And this can make a person sensitive to certain foods. The category is FODMAPs, and some of the things present in wheat are considered FODMAPs. So that's one other potential reason. It could be the glyphosate. It could be molecular mimicry. There is some research suggesting that there are some antibodies that are cross-reactive on the thyroid gland and the gluten protein. It's actually funny. I recently wrote an article about this, or updated an article, and there's just so many different ways that gluten can be reactive, and other parts of wheat as well.
Wow. And so let's break down a couple of the other ones in there. So you just said SIBO. So for somebody who may be less familiar with SIBO, who's listening, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Why does this happen for people? And what are some of the symptoms of even that? So people can start saying, oh my goodness, that might be something I'm experiencing.
I think one of the biggest symptoms is like you look 7 months pregnant, but you're not.
Okay.
So you wake up with a flat belly, and then as you go throughout your day, you keep eating, and all of a sudden you're like, how did I get pregnant? Like, how did my pregnancy progress from like not pregnant to super pregnant throughout the day? So the bloating is a big cardinal feature. You could have diarrhea, you could have constipation. Those are probably some of the biggest things that people will notice. Some people may actually be asymptomatic. So just because you don't have these symptoms doesn't mean you don't have the condition. The interesting thing is, for some people, they have the condition and they're treated for the condition, and they're like, oh, this is what it feels like to like not be bloated. So sometimes there's a disconnect, but definitely digestive issues would be a red flag. So bloating, if you are constantly bloated, that means that you could be at risk for SIBO. What it is normally in our small intestine, it's supposed to be pretty sterile, but we can have some bacteria from the colon kind of creep up there and like set up shop. And that can lead to intestinal permeability. Beyond like the SIBO, beyond like the bloating and digestive symptoms, there's tons of other symptoms that have been tied to it, from like fibromyalgia to rosacea to malabsorption of iron and B12 and a whole host of other nutrients.
Wow. And so since we're on the gut as well, so we have SIBO can be an issue, and then you said intestinal permeability, which I know most doctors and pharmacists are not, but the slang term that you'll often hear is leaky gut, even though that's not the sort of official term, just for anybody who might have heard that before who's newer to this topic. But, from this intestinal permeability space, what is happening there for people, and what are some ways that that's being impacted? And then how, again, for somebody who's newer to this, like how does the gut affect the thyroid? Like what's the relationship there as a whole?
So definitely the gut and the thyroid have the same kind of origins and cells that build them up. The interesting connection was made by Dr. Alessio Fasano, who is like a celiac and autoimmune researcher. What he found is that every case of autoimmune disease, and remember that 90 to 97% of thyroid issues are going to be autoimmune, that there's going to be 3 components in order for that autoimmune condition to manifest. You need the genetic predisposition, you need to have some kind of initiating trigger, and then you need to have the intestinal permeability. So the exciting thing is when you can remove one of these triggers, you can get the condition into remission. You can't really change our genes these day and age, perhaps with some advanced gene editing things, we might be able to do that,
CRISPR.
right? Yeah, put yourself on a CRISPR, right? And don't do it at home. Like, don't try it at home, right? We might be able to identify the triggers in some cases. In celiac disease, it's pretty straightforward. It's like the trigger is the gluten. So you kind of remove that and the person can get into remission as long as they're off of it. And so that's another kind of potential target. So that's why I do talk a lot about triggers in terms of thyroid issues. And then the third kind of potential target for intervention is that intestinal permeability. It's like, how do we get the gut to be less leaky? When we have that leaky gut, what happens is the foods that we eat aren't properly digested. And so we can end up like malabsorbing the nutrients from food. So we can get nutrient depleted. When the nutrients are also, when the food is not properly digested, the food can become reactive. So it can get through the holes in our intestines and kind of get recognized by our immune system as like a foreign invader. And essentially the immune system can create antibodies against the food that we're eating. And so every time we eat it, there's like this immune inflammatory response to the foods. And so one of the key components of really getting any autoimmune condition into remission is identifying like what is causing you to be inflamed and how do we lower that inflammation. And many times it centers around like reducing the inflammation stemmed from that gut and that impermeable gut wall.
And then would you say like the best place to go from there is like, hey, let's do an elimination diet for people? And if so, like what foods would somebody consider eliminating? And then how do we also repair the gut wall itself?
With regard to thyroid issues and Hashimoto's, the most common reactive foods in my experience are going to be gluten. So 88% of people feel like so much better. For some people, it's day and night. So, oh my gosh, I was fatigued and I had joint pain and horrible digestive symptoms gone, right? Dairy is another common reactive food. About 80% of people feel better off of it. I think in theory, I do think dairy can be a great source of protein and bodybuilders love their whey protein. And it can be great for some people. In my experience, it was night and day for me to get off of dairy. I was able to get rid of irritable bowel syndrome and acid reflux and my bloating within 3 days of going on a dairy-free diet. So I'm a big advocate for that. The carpal tunnel I had, which, I was considering surgery for carpal tunnel, that actually went away within 2 weeks of a dairy-free diet,
Crazy.
utilizing a P5P supplement and working with like a little bit of body work where I had that for like years. And I had like one of those like speech devices to like help me create reports at work. Like it was pretty intense. So
Oh my goodness. Wow.
it is a very, very powerful trigger for inflammation in some people. Then there's soy, and soy seems to be another common reactive food. And I would say, maybe a little bit less than gluten and dairy, but still very reactive. So that's a really good place for people to start. Another thing to consider is utilizing some nutrients that are typically deficient in people with thyroid issues. Selenium, anywhere from 83 micrograms to 400 micrograms a day, can reduce like anxiety, hair loss, and thyroid antibodies. Myo-inositol has been found to balance thyroid hormones. In subclinical hypothyroidism, it helps to balance blood sugar. It can make periods much better. These are some things that can be started without necessarily testing levels. There are some things that I oftentimes will recommend testing, and that would be vitamin D, B12, and ferritin, which is the active iron storage form. A lot of times these three nutrients, they're going to be low in people with hypothyroidism, and they're going to be responsible for a whole host of symptoms. Vitamin D, typically people are going to be more depressed with low vitamin D levels. Getting them up to the 60 to 80 range can be really helpful for mood, as well as reducing that thyroid autoimmunity. Ferritin, mood issues galore, fatigue, hair loss, getting that increased can be a really big game changer. And then B12 is another really important nutrient to consider too.
And it's so powerful because, as somebody who actually worked in client practice for about 10 years first, I always believed that everything was like root cause mental. There's trauma, there's something that we're storing at a subconscious level of mind that we haven't really worked through yet. That's like changing how we think, which is of course affecting our neurochemistry and how we feel. And then of course our behaviors to follow. And then,
as I went down the rabbit hole more in terms of health, like I just couldn't believe how important the mind-body relationship was, and how much. So I actually started working originally with a naturopathic doctor who's a friend of mine, and referring people out to her. And what I would see is that people who were doubling down on like all of the mind and sort of trauma work that I was doing, but then when they added the naturopathic component of food sensitivity tests, of like nutrient testing, making sure that they were up to date on all sorts of different, vitamins, supplements, minerals, all sorts of things, I would actually see like their progress mentally, emotionally improve so much faster than people that weren't going that path, with all other variables sort of being considered. And so to me, like that was just, mind blowing. And I think it's really exciting to hear for people as well who might be listening in our space that are like, oh wow, mood issues, or, these different challenges that they might be experiencing, I think are so powerful to be addressed, not just from a mind perspective, but also from the perspective of like check with your nutrients, your supplements, all those sorts of things. And would you recommend that people go and do like a blood test for these things and actually check them out? Or would you recommend just starting with some of the supplements, seeing how that feels for them? What would you say? So, absolutely. There's just so much synergy when we combine the mind-body practices with the nutrients. You could just see, and functional nutrition, you could just see like rapid changes and rapid growth. I had an internship at the Pfeiffer Treatment Center, which specialized in mental health issues, but they had an entirely nutritional approach. And one of the research studies they talked about was people who grew up in very, I guess, very difficult home situations, and ended up becoming, prisoners, right? Because of some criminal acts they committed. And these researchers were studying them, and they were like, well, we're not really surprised at how they turned out, but we're surprised that their siblings turned out, like some of their siblings turned out just fine. And what was the key difference? And one of their kind of thoughts on this and hypotheses, and they had some evidence to show this, was that it was nutritional balancing, that a lot of the people that had this quote unquote antisocial behavior were deficient in certain nutrients. And once those nutrients were balanced, these individuals were like still in prison. So they weren't like let out, but they reported they had fewer desires to commit, some of these criminal acts. And of course, most of us are probably like not in that same boat, but just the power of nutrition, right? It's like you can go from being like a super anxious person, and all of a sudden you get on some selenium, you focus on getting more protein and blood sugar balance, maybe get some myo-inositol in you and some iron, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I'm like a calm person. I thought this was my personality. Turned out it was nutritional imbalances, right? So as far as testing myo-inositol and selenium, generally most people can utilize that with thyroid issues. There's also some studies with OCD and anxiety that they utilize these nutrients, and they can help the outcomes with those. With ferritin, vitamin D, and B12, you definitely want to get a blood test for that, and that can be ordered through most physicians, and it's covered on most insurance companies. I will say you can also self-order it. I know I set up like channels for my community just to self-order things like that. And then sometimes, depending on their insurance, they could submit it to insurance, because I feel like this information is so critical to our health that I don't want it behind like a firewall of having to like find a doctor that will order the test for you. And some doctors like don't want to order tests, which I don't personally understand. But generally, these are very accessible, and they're just simple blood tests. A little bit trickier, of course, to do in children, but just require just a little bit of blood, and then you can really get a good idea if you're low in those levels. And it can be a really big game-changing, I just like intervention just to be sufficient in those nutrients.
Absolutely. And it's so powerful to hear even just about that study and how that was such an impactor. It's just like diet and nutrition for people who grew up in similar families. So my sort of background was that I grew up in definitely a little bit of trauma, a good bit of trauma in my household for sure. And I went all into like the mental health space and got really into, because I had a lot of like resentment and anger and hurt and things like that. Did a lot of work and thought like, oh my gosh, like this was everything. Like I healed all these things. And then started having a lot of inflammation issue, little things that started popping up, nothing big. But so started a few years ago on a health journey of digestion and all these different things, and just have loved reading and learning ever since. But one of the things I noticed is when I just started changing my nutrients, and this is more for anybody listening to this, when I started changing my nutrient intake and just like actually getting into a good habit of like eating a lot more clean and being mindful about the nutrients I'm taking in and supplementing, I noticed that I had all these amazing tools to deal with like frustration or irritability. So I wouldn't stay in that. But then instead, and I didn't realize how much I was coping. Like I didn't realize that I would be like kind of grumpy in the mornings and then kind of work through it. And when I actually changed my nutrient intake, for me, it was like, oh, I'm not grumpy in the mornings. There's nothing to work on or work through. And that was so crazy to me to even think about. But it's interesting because we get so used to how we're feeling as well. We get so like accustomed to living a certain way and experiencing some of these things. So, a huge benefit to really go down that path for people. And so going into some of the other components you've talked about. So you talked about sort of like eliminating dairy, eliminating gluten, soy, you said was a big thing, really repairing how we're eating by taking in proper supplements. You listed lots of really great ones there. What about for people who are seeing, like, let's say they hear this, they go test for their thyroid, something like that, and they fall within these normal ranges of things, but they're really at the low end. What would you say to somebody like that? Like, is their body giving them feedback? Should they still be paying attention to these different things? Or those things that, just sort of from the Western perspective, follow just what the ranges are?
So of course, that's such an important question with regard to testing for thyroid function. I know I personally was in my 20s and I was already in pharmacy school and I was like, I'm really tired all the time. I don't think this is normal for a 20-year-old to be this tired. And I would go to my doctors and I would ask to be tested. I was like, okay, can you test my thyroid and can you test me for anemia? And they would say, sure. And all of my labs would be quote unquote normal. But the issue is they didn't really do the right labs. And that's why I was so specific talking about ferritin, because it's an early indicator of anemia, right?
Yes.
And there's also early indicators of thyroid disease. So most doctors will order a TSH test, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is something that our pituitary gland makes when it senses that we have low thyroid hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone will be high when our internal of thyroid hormone are low, right? That is if your, pituitary is communicating well with the rest of the body. So one issue you can have is like you might have pituitary issues or just perhaps like this impaired feedback loop where you actually have low levels of thyroid hormone that are available to interact with your thyroid receptors throughout your body, but your pituitary isn't really picking that up on that. And so I always recommend testing not just your TSH, but also you can test free T3 and free T4 levels. These are the free thyroid hormone levels that are not bound to, they're not bound to like these proteins that prevent them from interacting with receptors. So always get those. And then the other thing is thyroid antibodies. These can be elevated for like 10, sometimes 15 years.
Before
TSH is changed, because thyroid antibodies are a marker that indicates there's some kind of inflammatory damage happening within the thyroid gland. In the early stages, people can still kind of compensate for that, right? So they might not be like fully hypothyroid. They might not be like bedridden and super sluggish, but they're going to feel it. Oftentimes their mental health is going to be affected. So they're going to be like, I'm kind of depressed. I'm having trouble with word finding, having OCD tendencies, and a lot of anxiety. This is going to be a really big thing that people go through. And unfortunately, many of them get referred to a psychiatrist for medications, or they're called hypochondriacs. And it's truly heartbreaking to me, but really these antibodies are like this huge red flag that your thyroid is like fighting, right? And it's fighting all this inflammation. So thyroid peroxidase antibodies, TPO antibodies, and thyroglobulin antibodies, TG antibodies, are the ones to ask for if you have any of these symptoms and you suspect you might have a thyroid issue. And then the last part of it is like the TSH numbers. I know I'm from Poland originally, and my mom and my brother always joke that I whenever I go to Poland, I give everybody thyroid issues because I actually like look at their lab tests. And I know I had one relative that was wearing like this like parka in the middle of the spring and everybody's got short sleeves on. And I'm like, Auntie, have you had your thyroid tested? And she's like, yeah, my doctor said it was normal. And then I looked at the TSH test and levels were like 8 or 9 when the optimum reference range is anywhere from 0.5 to 2 for most people to feel their best. For fertility purposes, you don't want it to be above 2.5. Like you have higher risks of miscarriage above 2.5. When my TSH was at 4, I was like a sloth. Like I didn't want to leave my bed. I was cold all the time. I was just like, give me more blankets. This is all I want to do. And you know, the reference ranges, I think they're getting better and tighter now. But when they were first determined, doctors actually, or the researchers that created them, thyroid disease is so common, affecting like 1 in 5 women at some point, that there were people with actual thyroid dysfunction that were quote unquote like the healthy controls to determine the healthy reference ranges. So,
Oh, wow.
so now we know better. Like now,
Yeah.
like if it's not 0.5 to 2, then ask more questions.
Yeah, and that's such good feedback too, because I think that there are a lot of, tests and we get these ranges for things and it's like, okay, wait, but that could still be indicative of something. And I think the earlier you catch things, the faster you can also get back on track, right? Before it's something that becomes really out of hand. So I think that's amazing to touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the thyroid antibodies are going to be elevated for about 10 years before you have that thyroid damage, where once your thyroid gland is damaged to a certain point, like you can't make enough of your own thyroid hormone. So you need to be on thyroid meds. And it's much easier to prevent that damage than it is to like try to go back.
That. Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to pop in here and let you know we are doing a 7-day free trial to the All Access Membership Pass at PDS, which means you get access to literally everything inside of the school. And this includes the 4 live webinars I do with our students every single week. And on top of that, you get access to all of our different courses. We have over 55 different courses on relationships, communication, boundaries, emotional mastery, guilt and shame, learning your needs, so many different facets that are really important to master our lives and feel really good about our lives going forward. And last but not least, there's a daily community event. We have trained facilitators and coaches who are in there doing that work, showing up to support you on your journey every single day. Please join me on the other side. Come check it out. See if it's a fit for you. I'd love to see you there. Go ahead and sign up by clicking the link in the description box below.
And so what about like the T4, T3 part? So you gave really great explanations for the other ones. The T4 to T3, like, what are some of those differences for people? How can they better understand what that is and how to sort of impact that part of things there as well?
So T4 is it's one of the main thyroid hormones, and T3 is another main thyroid hormone. T3 is the more physiologically active thyroid hormone. So that's the one that's kind of like gives us, that beautiful hair and like a really fast metabolism. And it is just the one that kind of wakes up our brain. Both are important. It's just that T3 is a little bit more powerful. And typically when I have people, and I'm not going to give numbers because there's like different numbers used by different labs and countries, but typically when you get your results back, you would want to look at like, what is the reference range, right? So if it's, let's just say if it's 5 to 10, if you're like at 5.1, that's probably like not the best. You kind of want to be like right in that 7.5 mark for optimal health. And then you also want to look at your ratio. So a lot of times I see people that are like, I already take thyroid hormone and I still feel like crap. And many times they take T4 thyroid hormone, which, in like a perfect pharmacology textbook, it gets converted into just the right amount of T3 hormone. But this doesn't always happen in the body. So like, then I have people look at their T4 to T3 ratio. So if you're looking at like, this is your reference range and you've got your T4 over here and your T3 over here, then there's a mismatch there. Like both of them should be kind of like lining up in the middle. So if you have low T3, but your T4 is fine and you're on medications, there's probably a conversion problem where you're not changing enough of that T4 into the active T3. A lot of times it'll be people like, I'm taking thyroid meds, but I'm still losing hair. I'm taking thyroid meds, but I still have brain fog. I'm taking thyroid meds, but I'm still struggling with my weight. And that's usually a conversion issue.
Wow. And what impacts like a conversion issue for somebody?
There's a few things that can impact this. Two main drivers of it are going to be low ferritin levels, which we talked about already, and then a lot of stress. And this can also be measured as a reverse T3 test. So sometimes I'll see people that they don't have like thyroid antibodies, their TSH is fine, but they have all the thyroid symptoms. And in that case, testing something known as reverse T3, which is essentially the non-active thyroid hormone, which I guess takes up space. So it interacts with your thyroid receptors, but rather than like turning them on, it just like blocks them, right? This is something that that can be elevated in like autoimmune and like non-thyroid derived thyroid issues. So these are usually like secondary thyroid issues because you're under a ton of stress or you're super nutrient depleted or you're going through something very traumatic. That's when that reverse T3 is going to be elevated. And this is to me an indication that we need to work either on your iron stores or your stress response. Some other factors that can help with that T4 to T3 conversion, really selenium and zinc are really great for that too. So some really great nutrients can help.
Yeah, that's such a powerful breakdown for anybody who's just, goes to maybe a doctor, doesn't really, they feel a little bit defeated. They want to learn how to actually read their own sort of tests and be clear about it. I think that's really, really powerful with all the different things they can do. And so what do you think? Like, I've noticed there's this big hot topic lately around methylation, and some people talking about how methylation and the thyroid kind of go hand in hand. First of all, like to anybody listening who's not sure what that is, can you maybe talk a little bit about that and then how that can connect back to the thyroid, if at all?
Sure. I think methylation is a really big topic, but I'm going to try to keep it just very specific to what I do and work with in people with thyroid issues. So typically what I focus on is looking at whether or not their methylation might be impaired. So we'll look at whether or not they have gene mutations. So the MTHFR gene, for example, some people have those mutations, which is in essence makes it more difficult to utilize like folic acid in order to like do a lot of things in the body. Methylation is like such an important process that helps us with brain function, with energy production, with our hormones, with detoxification. And it can also help with balancing and producing thyroid hormones. So in many cases, if I see a person has these gene variations, this might mean that they may need to utilize a different form of folic acid, such as methylfolate. And this can be a really big game changer for like that brain fog, fatigue, chronic fatigue, depression, heavy periods. This could be a really big game changer for like feeling, chemical sensitivities. And I also will recommend looking at homocysteine levels. When those are like above a 7, that indicates that you might benefit from more methylation cofactors, as well as potentially more methylfolate, potentially more B2, B12, B6, getting some more of those B vitamins. And there's also other cofactors like trimethylglycine that can be super, super helpful. I typically will find people have low stomach acid, and I've started utilizing a digestive enzyme known as betaine with pepsin for people with thyroid issues that contains trimethylglycine. And this is something that people will say, like, my brain woke up for the first time. My fatigue is gone. My pain throughout my body is gone. My mood is so much better just with that, a little bit of methylation support with that and stomach acid support.
Wow. And so would that mean that people are intaking food, they don't have the proper digestive enzymes or amount of stomach acid to break the food down, which is then if they also have leaky gut for intestinal permeability, for example, then they have this sort of added stress on their body, which is then creating that inflammation. Like, is there sort of a chain reaction of events, or how does the the stomach acid then affect the thyroid? Like, how do those things end up kind of linking back together?
So, it's always bidirectional. So the studies done in people with thyroid issues have found that they have either low stomach acid levels or produce no stomach acid. So this is oftentimes something that we do need to supplement with for people who are in the early stages. Sometimes this is caused by advanced age. Sometimes this is caused by hypothyroidism. Sometimes it's caused by H. pylori, which is a bacteria that has been shown to trigger thyroid disease, both Graves and Hashimoto's, and can help people get into remission when that's treated. And so a lot of times, when you have that low stomach acid, you're going to be at risk for more food sensitivities, and you're going to be extremely exhausted whenever you eat because your body is not going to be efficiently digesting food. And then you're not going to be extracting your nutrients from your food, and so you won't be able to get like energy and nutrition that way from the foods that you're eating, like the amino acids to repair your body, and all of the good vitamins and nutrients too, like ferritin, or like the iron, especially in B12.
Wow. And then it just becomes a vicious cycle because then you're nutrient deficient, which then is going to affect everything else, it sounds like.
It really, when I was first trying to get myself well, I was like, okay, well, thyroid hormone, great, but it's like such a small piece of it, because whenever one change happens in the body, something else kind of changes. And then we have all of these amazing communication pathways. And so a lot of times to really produce like complete healing in a person, you have to fix a lot of these broken pathways. And once the pathways are mended, right, you can see like a tremendous amount of improvement. And, to your point, when you said earlier, when you're just like focusing on like meds and symptom management, it's a bit of like playing whack-a-mole. So maybe like that benzo really helped with your anxiety that was caused by low selenium levels, but that's going to show up, like that low selenium is going to show up in you losing your hair, right? Or, there's other ways where it's going to show up. And then you're like, okay, now I have to get like hair transplants, right? Or I have to try and do this. And so it really is like, my focus is like trying to get those dials dialed in, right? Getting into the optimal ranges for the nutrients and feeling out where the body might need that support.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense. And I think too, it's like your body's always telling you something, and we just like ignore it. There's a symptom and we don't like go further into it. We also lose that feedback that our body's giving us, which makes sense that it would then kind of change forms. It's going to come out in your hair. It's going to come out somewhere else. So yeah, very powerful. So, last sort of question as we wrap up here is if somebody is hearing this and they're going, oh my goodness, I hear myself in this, that sounds like me. And okay, I'm going to start with some of the food elimination. I'm going to, take some of the nutrients that you recommended, or vitamins, and is sort of going down that path. What is a hopeful, outcome for somebody, just who might feel down in the dumps or consumed with it? What are some things that you see on a regular basis in your practice, or that you've seen in your own life, that maybe people can hope to trend towards?
Gosh, I mean, I get so many success stories from people just on social media or writing into me. I've even had people like stop me and give me hugs randomly, at different places, conferences, or sometimes usually at Target if I'm not, if I'm like, kind of a mess. That's usually when I see people. But really, I mean, it can be, I've had people in their 70s that are like, I was fatigued for the last 30 years. And something you recommended, like I have so much energy now to interact with my horses or follow these amazing hobbies I have. I've had people who weren't able to have children and they're like, I thought I was infertile. Now, thanks to you, I just have this baby, right? But, obviously they're happy to have a baby, but it wasn't even on their radar that they could get pregnant. People with just like this, I've had people who, had those labels of bipolar disorder. And they were like, you know what? It just turned out like I really needed to support my thyroid and my adrenals and my blood sugar balance and my nutrients. And like, I feel like I feel calm. Like to your point, what you said is you do not need all of these like coping strategies. You do not need all of these, like, I love therapy. I get therapy weekly, but you know what I mean? It's like, you don't need to do 40 hours of intensive therapy when you've got your
Everything else in order.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so it's just a big game changer for people when they actually get their body gets the support that they need. For me personally, my husband, I used to have panic attacks whenever he'd go jogging. I thought like something would happen to him. And he was very much like worried that I barely I would call him 10 times if he was running and he was going to Las Vegas for his friend's bachelor party. And he like wrote me out a whole plan where he was going to be like step by step and just, like this emergency plan and whatever. I was like, and it was right after I got myself into remission and had my selenium levels and blood sugar balanced and ferritin balanced. And I was like, oh yeah, just have fun. He's like, you mean you're not worried? And I'm like, I've got nothing to worry about. Like it's a big game changer, right?
Wow, that's so powerful. That's really, really beautiful. It's so funny because so many of our listeners who are, we spend a lot of time focused on attachment trauma, so trauma from childhood, but how it manifests in different attachment styles. And one of the attachment styles is anxious preoccupied, and it's what a big part of our demographic is. And they very much have like fears that something bad will happen to their partner or loved one as soon as there's sort of a change. And it's just so it's so interesting to hear that you were almost expressing parts of that then were changed because your physical health was changed. Like it's just pretty mind-blowing to hear about. So very, very cool. So what's up next for you? Where can people find more out about you, what you're doing, what your offerings are, for anybody who's interested?
My website is thyroidpharmacist.com, and I'm also on social media under Izabella Wentz PharmD. So you could find me there. And I have books about Hashimoto's, 3 of them on Amazon, as well as the book about adrenal transformation. The adrenal transformation protocol is something you can use even if you don't have Hashimoto's. So I wrote it for a lot of my friends that were like, hey, how are you so calm? And how are you like this? I know you were a hot mess before, before you did all of this. And I don't have a thyroid issue, but how can you help me? So it's for people who have like anxiety, panic attacks, fatigue, brain fog, libido and pain issues in their body. And whether they have a thyroid issue or not, it's going to have helpful strategies to really balance their stress response from that physiological standpoint so that they can really feel like calm, energetic, and really feel like the person they're meant to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. So we'll put all of those links in the show notes below. I also have to just give a little shout out to your book, The Root Cause, because I love that it was just sort of like a full synopsis on health in general. And I have been researching lots of different things around health for like a decade, and it's like a sort of hobby passion of mine. And then I read this book and it was like the summary of everything that I thought somebody needed to know getting started on their health journey. I was like, wow, I wish I read that 10 years ago. It would have given me the foundation for everything. So I think that's an amazing book as well. And thank you so much for being here today. Really excited to share this with our audience, and really appreciate all your amazing insight.
Thank you so much for having me. What a joy and pleasure to be with you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with friends and family who are on their journey of personal development and growth. And thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be back with more insights to guide you on your journey. And until then, keep practicing our tools and strategies to change your subconscious mind and apply some of the powerful learnings from this podcast so that you experience real life transformation.